For most of the last decade, if you wanted to signal that you had truly arrived in Riyadh, in Beverly Hills, in Shanghai, you didn't necessarily buy a Rolls-Royce. You bought a Maybach. Mercedes' ultra-luxury badge became the default flex of the newly rich across 3 continents, moving more metal in some years than Rolls-Royce and Bentley combined. And now, in the one market that made it, it's falling apart. Sales in China, where more than 60% of every Maybach ever sold ends up, dropped again in the first half of 2026. Mercedes has quietly told dealers to expect fewer than 20,000 units a year going forward, a level the brand hasn't seen since before its supposed golden era even began. Here's the part that should bother you more than the sales chart. Maybach was never built the way Rolls-Royce or Bentley are built. It doesn't have its own factory floor, its own dedicated chassis, its own reason to exist as an engineering object. It is, and has been since 2015, a Mercedes S-Class wearing a bigger grille and a price tag with an extra 0. For over 20 years, across 2 separate attempts, Mercedes has been trying to convince the wealthiest buyers on earth that a trim level is the same thing as true bespoke luxury. The strategy worked, right up until the moment the market that believed it hardest started asking for its money back. This is the story of how a badge got mistaken for an institution, why it took Mercedes 1 bankrupt relaunch and a decade of quiet re-engineering to make the formula profitable, and why the version of Maybach making headlines in 2026 is finally being forced to prove the whole thing was never a lie in the first place. To understand why the Maybach name carries any weight at all, you have to go back before Mercedes existed in its modern form. Wilhelm Maybach was one of the 2 founding engineers behind Daimler itself, the man who built the engine that powered the very first car to carry the Mercedes name. In 1909 he broke away to start his own company, originally to build engines for Zeppelin airships, then for ships, then finally for cars of his own. Between 1921 and 1940, Maybach built some of the most technically advanced luxury automobiles in the world, cars with names like the Zeppelin, a 3-ton cabriolet that borrowed its name from the airships whose engines Maybach also supplied. These weren't badge exercises. They were genuine engineering flagships, built by a company that answered to no one else's platform and no one else's parts bin. That's the actual inheritance here, a name earned by an engineer who built things nobody else could build, at a time when doing that meant something concrete, your own tooling, your own chassis, your own reason to exist. Through the late 1930s and into the war, Maybach's factories shifted almost entirely to producing engines for military vehicles, and passenger car production never resumed once the fighting ended. In 1960, Daimler-Benz bought what was left of the company and let the name sit dormant for almost 4 decades, occasionally lending it to internal engine divisions but never again to a car anyone could buy. That's 37 years of a legendary name sitting in a filing cabinet, waiting for someone in Stuttgart to decide it was worth reviving. If you're the kind of person who wants more of these stories, the ones the automotive press covers in a single paragraph but never actually explains, this is a good moment to subscribe, because what Mercedes did with that dormant name next is where this story really starts. In 1997, the decision came down: bring Maybach back. The revival, when it finally arrived in 2002, looked promising on paper. 2 models, the Maybach 57 and 62, named for their length in decimeters, 5.7 and 6.2 meters respectively. Fully bespoke interiors, reclining rear thrones, and, on some versions, a champagne cooler built into the console. Price tags starting around $350,000 and climbing well past that for the stretch 62. Mercedes positioned both directly against the Rolls-Royce Phantom and the Bentley Arnage, at the exact moment those 2 century-old rivals had just been split from each other and sold off separately to BMW and Volkswagen. It looked like an opening. American buyers, with the ink still drying on the Daimler-Chrysler merger, saw Maybach as a homegrown alternative to old-world British aristocracy on wheels, and for a few years the order books actually looked reasonable. Mercedes had forecast selling somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 units a year once the brand matured, with faster, more powerful 57S and 62S variants added later to chase buyers who wanted the size without feeling like they were riding in a hearse. Even in the best years before the crisis hit, actual demand never got close to that forecast. It peaked at barely 100 cars a year. Then came 2007, and with it a financial crisis that gutted exactly the kind of speculative, symbolic wealth that had been buying seven-figure sedans as a personality trait. Sales didn't dip, they cratered. Journalists who requested test cars were told to sit in the back seat rather than the front, because the cars, Mercedes explained, were made to be driven in, not to drive. Reviews came back lukewarm at best, and one persistent joke followed the car everywhere: that it looked less like a Rolls-Royce rival and more like a very well-maintained funeral car. But the financial crisis wasn't really the problem here. It was the excuse that finally let everyone say out loud what they'd been quietly thinking since 2002. This car wasn't what Mercedes claimed it was, and the numbers were about to prove it in brutal detail. By 2010, Maybach sold precisely 157 cars worldwide. In that same year, Rolls-Royce sold 2,711. A single year later, in 2011, Maybach's entire global total fell to 44 units. Fewer cars in 12 months than most luxury dealerships move in a single weekend. Car Magazine did the math on what this actually cost Daimler, and landed on a figure close to $400,000 lost on every unit sold, across a program that had burned through more than $1.3 billion since 2002. Fortune's verdict on the whole venture was blunt, calling the business plan remarkably clumsy, and pointing directly at the design flaw underneath the marketing. Daimler had built its supposed Rolls-Royce killer on an aging Mercedes S-Class wheelbase, instead of engineering something of its own from the ground up. Top Gear went further, ranking it among the worst cars produced in the last 20 years. That single decision, building on someone else's underpinnings, is the hinge this entire story turns on. Rolls-Royce and Bentley, whatever their other flaws, were building cars on architecture that existed for no other purpose than to be a Rolls-Royce or a Bentley. Maybach was a Mercedes wearing a bigger grille, and increasingly buyers spending $400,000 could tell the difference in their bones. On November 25, 2011, Daimler's own management announced the brand was finished. On December 17, 2012, the last Maybach rolled off the line in Sindelfingen, Germany, roughly 10 years and 3,000 units after it had promised to challenge the oldest luxury names in the world. Daimler's official line was that killing Maybach would clear the way for a stronger S-Class. What it actually cleared the way for was a much cheaper version of the same idea. Here's what makes 2015 the most important year in this entire story, and almost nobody clocked it at the time. That year, Rolls-Royce announced it was building something called the Architecture of Luxury, a dedicated aluminium spaceframe platform engineered from scratch since 2013, designed to underpin every future Rolls-Royce and explicitly not shared with a single other BMW Group product. It would debut 2 years later under the Phantom 8, then the Cullinan, then the Ghost. Rolls-Royce had learned the exact opposite lesson from Maybach's collapse. If you want to sell a car as the genuine pinnacle of the industry, you cannot build it on someone else's underpinnings, and you say so loudly, in public, at every launch event. That same year, 2015, Mercedes made the opposite bet. Instead of engineering a standalone Maybach architecture, it quietly relaunched Maybach as a trim designation, not a company. No factory of its own, no chassis of its own, just the ultimate version of the existing S-Class badge grille and a new manufacturer customization program bolted on top of the same W222 platform every other S-Class buyer was driving home. Keep that in mind because it's the exact decision Fortune had called remarkably clumsy 3 years earlier, just repackaged with sharper marketing. The one real difference was that Mercedes stopped pretending Maybach was its own company and started treating it as what it had always functionally been, a very expensive costume for an existing car. And that smaller, more honest version of the lie turned out to be far more profitable than the expensive, dishonest one had ever been. The strategy worked, at least by the only measure Mercedes actually cared about. Instead of one flopped flagship, Maybach became a checkbox. Buy the S-Class, tick the Maybach option, get a bigger grille, softer leather, a longer wheelbase, and a badge that meant something to the valet. Mercedes extended it to the GLS SUV, then to an electric version riding on the EQS, then to a two-seat Maybach SL, built off the existing AMG SL platform to chase Bentley Continental GT Mulliner customers directly. By the middle of the 2020s, the numbers looked nothing like 2011. Every third S-Class sold worldwide was now leaving the factory as a Maybach, with penetration running even higher in China specifically. In 2023, Mercedes delivered a record 28,000 Maybach vehicles globally, and more than 60% of every single one went to Chinese buyers, compared with roughly a quarter of Mercedes' overall car business. Reviewers noticed the pattern even as they praised the execution. One UK road test placed the Mercedes-Maybach S-Class a notch below its Bentley and Rolls-Royce rivals in outright presence, while still calling it beautifully executed. That's the whole trick in one sentence. Nobody was claiming Maybach out-engineered Rolls-Royce's Ghost or Bentley's Flying Spur. They were simply noting it was a very good version of something else wrapped in over 150 paint colours and a manufacturer embroidery program, and priced as if that distinction didn't matter. This was the payoff. A badge that cost a fraction of what a dedicated architecture would have, generating margins a standard S-Class could never touch on its own. But notice what actually happened underneath the record number. Mercedes hadn't solved the problem Fortune identified back in 2012. It had simply found a country wealthy enough, and growing fast enough, to stop asking the question out loud. As long as China's newly rich kept buying, nobody needed to check whether the emperor had clothes on underneath the badge. Keep that dependency in mind because it's about to become the entire story. A brand that leans on one country for the majority of its global volume isn't just successful, it's exposed. And starting in 2024, the first real cracks in that exposure began to show, right as China's property crisis started eating into exactly the kind of paper wealth that had been buying Maybachs like accessories. By 2025, the exposure Mercedes had quietly built its entire Maybach strategy on stopped being theoretical. Mercedes-Benz group car sales fell 9% globally that year, to 1.8 million vehicles, with China alone down 19%. The company pointed to tariffs and a competitive market environment, which is true, but it undersells what was actually happening beneath the S-Class and Maybach lines specifically. The two nameplates Mercedes' own guidance cuts had already flagged as hit hardest by China's real estate slowdown. The bigger problem wasn't discount wars. It was that Chinese luxury buyers finally had a credible domestic alternative. The Maxtros 800, built through a partnership between JAC and Huawei, sold more than 6,000 units by the end of May 2026, compared with roughly 3,700 Maybachs over that same window in the same market at a similar price point. A Chinese-built car had just outbadged the badge. Mercedes' own first quarter 2026 results made the scale of the slide impossible to spin away. Global sales down 6%, China down 27%, operating profit down 17% to €1.9 billion, and the car division's adjusted margin compressed from 7.3% to 4.1% in a single year. Maybach's own China volume fell 4% in the first half of 2026 to just under 9,000 units, and Mercedes told dealers privately to expect fewer than 20,000 units a year for the foreseeable future, a level the brand may not clear again for years. Then came the detail that should have embarrassed everyone in Stuttgart. In March 2026, Mercedes authorized a $25,000 dealer incentive just to move the Maybach EQS, its electric flagship, off dealer lots. The year before, that incentive had reached $50,000. An ultra-luxury badge that needs a 5-figure discount to find a buyer isn't ultra-luxury anymore. It's a Mercedes with a coupon attached. None of this happened in a vacuum. Back in 2022, CEO Ola Källenius had bet the entire company on the opposite idea. That Mercedes should raise prices and quietly retire cheaper entry models to lean harder into the luxury identity Maybach was supposed to represent. By 2025 and 2026, with China cooling and mainstream buyers pulling back everywhere, that bet was reversed. Mercedes is now planning a broader lineup across every price point again, reportedly including a successor to the entry-level A-Class it had once talked about phasing out. The company that tried to go all in on the Maybach idea of luxury is now hedging that same bet company-wide, which tells you exactly how much confidence Stuttgart has left in the badge carrying the weight on its own. So here's where the lie finally meets the bill. 24 years after the first Maybach failed for being an S-Class in disguise, Mercedes is now openly building the thing it should have built the first time. Reports sourced to Car and Driver describe plans for genuinely bespoke Maybach models, internally referred to as legend and myth, ultra-limited cars with made-to-measure bodies and unique body panels, not just paint and stitching options laid over an existing shell. An unnamed senior Mercedes representative put it plainly, saying the company is turning Maybach into a coach-built super Mercedes. Not quite Rolls-Royce's drop-tail, a car that starts near $30 million and is built one at a time from a blank sheet of paper. But closer than anything Mercedes has attempted since Wilhelm Maybach's own workshop went quiet in 1940. Read that timeline again. It took a collapsed launch, a decade of quiet badge engineering, one record-breaking year, and a Chinese sales crash for Mercedes to finally admit, functionally, that the critics were right the entire time. A trim level was never going to be enough on its own. Mercedes' own Maybach leadership has told Handelsblatt the brand remains firmly anchored in the luxury segment. That is exactly the kind of sentence a company says right before it quietly rewrites its entire strategy. Rolls-Royce spent a decade and untold engineering hours building an architecture it didn't have to share with anyone. Mercedes spent that same decade selling the idea that it didn't need to bother. Now, with China no longer buying that idea at the old volume, Mercedes doesn't have a choice left. It has to build the real thing, or watch the most profitable badge in its entire portfolio get out-luxuried by a Huawei joint venture. So what actually went wrong here? Twice. With the same brand. It comes down to three mistakes. First, Mercedes assumed a name was the same thing as an engineering foundation. Wilhelm Maybach earned his reputation building things nobody else could copy. His name alone couldn't do that work 80 years later, not without the chassis, the tooling, and the dedicated architecture to back it up. Second, when the first attempt collapsed in 2012, Mercedes fixed the economics without ever fixing the underlying lie. Turning Maybach into a trim level instead of a standalone company made the numbers work, but it never answered the actual question critics raised back in 2002, whether this was genuine ultra-luxury or an extremely expensive costume. Third, Mercedes let one country's growth quietly cover for that unanswered question for almost a decade. As long as China kept buying, nobody had to find out what Maybach was actually worth without the badge markup attached. Markets eventually ask for a refund on beliefs like that, and China just did. Whether Mercedes' new coach-built legend and myth models actually close that gap, or just repeat 2002 with better marketing and a bigger budget, is going to define whether Maybach survives its second real test as a brand. If you want to see how the company on the other side of this entire story actually built the real thing and turned scarcity itself into the most profitable business model in the car industry, that's exactly what we're covering next inside Rolls-Royce's own numbers. Subscribe now so you don't miss it, and I'll see you in the next one.